Hello, everyone. I am sorry I cannot be there with you, but we are going to be learning more about the Middle Ages today, also known as the medieval era in music. Before we get started, make sure that you have this handout with you. They should be printed off on the back counter. It should be front and back, and there's different boxes that have different activities, whether it be true or false, fill in the blanks, matching. So make sure you put your name on this paper. And then as we go through, you are going to be able to fill this out. For example, on the first slide, you'll see that the medieval era is about, that C stands for circa, or about the year 502, and you'll see that year on the screen. Next, we'll go to fun facts and so forth. You can just follow along in your listening guide. All right, so let's get started. All right, so as I said, we're going to be studying the Middle Ages, the medieval era, more in detail. The year is 500 to 1450. And again, that C stands for circa or about. There's some discrepancies on when it actually started, but I'm going with 500 to the year 1450. Here are some fun facts about the Middle Ages. It was a time of plague and war. It was considered the Dark Ages because of that. Music was mostly in the church, and it was also mostly monophonic, which, if you remember from the first video we watched, that means one melody line, and we'll hear more about that later. Universities were being built in Europe. The Roman Empire had just fallen. Art was restricted to religion. The paintings were often of different saints or church related matters. The Crusades were happening between the Christians and the Muslims. And some of the inventions during this time included the crossbow, the flamethrower, windmills, and spectacles like eyeglasses. So here on this next slide, we have several videos. We're just going to watch this first video together. It's a really short um, showing of things that are happening during the Middle Ages. The other videos that I have listed here, I'm actually going to go over with you. You can feel free to watch them on your own if you would like. We may watch one or two of them later together, but I'm going to go over a lot of that with you here. So first, this just gives you an idea of what was going on during this time period that we're talking about. All right, so you can see that video went just a little bit past um, where we are at in the Middle Ages, but that is okay. Hopefully, you were able to follow along and read some of the things that were going on during this time. All right, we are going to move right along into some different music terms from the medieval era. The first that we're going to learn about is Gregorian chant or plain song. I have a video here so you can hear how it sounds. I know you guys are just going to love it. But it was singing in unison, that word that we talked about before, monophonic. One melody line, everybody sang the same thing. This type of singing was named for Pope Gregory. That's why it's called the Gregorian chant. It's typically based on sacred text, so that means religious text. There was no accompaniment. You'll notice that there are no instruments along with the singers. There's also no rhythm. The music follows the natural flow of the text. There's no harmonizing. Monks were added to a boys' choir in order to create fuller and brighter sound with higher and lower voices. They started figuring out, oh, one melody line, this isn't really that exciting. What can we do to make it more exciting? And that's what they did, was they added the boys' choir to create more sounds. So here is what Gregorian chant sounds like.
Introducing Allcam MyEye, the most advanced wearable AI for vision impairment.
All right, so that gives you a pretty good idea of what Gregorian chant sounded like. So, again, completely different than what we're used to music sounding like today. I'm not sure if you noticed, but what they did to write quote unquote music notes down looks nothing like what we have today. I mean, I guess you could say a little bit because there's lines and spaces, but they didn't really have music notes. They had little squiggles, and we will be talking later about what that actually is. All right, moving on. Excuse me. All right, the next musical terms we're going to talk about: monophony, polyphony, and melismatic text. Monophony we have talked about several times, only we called it monophonic. That's where it was the single voice or a single melody line. That's what we just heard in Gregorian chant. Polyphony was when they started adding multiple melodies happening at the same time. Again, they were wanting to create more exciting music and experimenting with how to do so. So they started in experimenting with polyphony. Melismatic text is when a single syllable of text has multiple melody notes. So, if any of you have seen Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, there's a scene where he's singing "Alrighty then," because that's what he said all the time, "Alrighty then." But he sings it, and he's at this, I don't know if it's a Buddhist temple, but he's a monk there or hanging out with the monks, and so he sings, "Alrighty then," or something to that effect. But if you'll notice, when I sang all, that was one word, but I sang a lot of notes with that one word. So we will hear more examples of that. All right, this is a great example of monophony versus polyphony, and they also throw in homophony in there as well, although we don't talk about that quite as much during this time period. And forgive the ads. So this says monophony. All the voices sing the same notes together, only one melodic line. We've talked about that several times. Homophony. All the voices sing different notes at a similar pace or parallel melodic lines. And this is something that we will also discuss here in a few more slides. It's also called parallel organum, where you have notes that are moving in the same direction and at the same time, but they're different notes. They're just moving in the same direction. So we'll talk more about that soon. Polyphony. Each voice sings a different melody, so there's simultaneous melodies going on. All right, so I hope that helped explain the difference between the different types of song that we hear from this time frame. All right, as I said earlier, I mentioned something called parallel organum. This is where we're going to talk more about it. Again, like I mentioned earlier, they were trying to come up with ways to make music sound more exciting and make music just sound like more than one melody line, what they were used to. So they did 3 different types of organum, and I'm going to have a listening example of each so that you can hear them. Parallel organum was when harmony was created by a new line played or sung in parallel to the original. So here we're going to hear and see an example of that. Now remember, this is where you have notes that are moving in the same direction at the same time. All right, and I'm going to back it up just so we can see that screen again. So as you can see, when the second voice comes in here, they're both moving up the staff together. So they move up here, they stay the same, and then they both move up. So they're moving in parallel motion, and that's why we call that parallel organum. The second type of organum is where one voice stays on one note while the other voice moves around. This is called a drone organum. The drone can be done with voices or it could be done with instruments. Here is an example. And I'm just going to pause it real quick. You should be able to hear the melody being sung above, and then if you listen closely, you should be able to hear a lower note being sung below the melody and just being held. All right. Again, that was drone organum. The last type of organum we're going to look at is called free organum. This is where different voices move independently of each other. So as you can see and as you could hopefully hear, there was two voices here and they were both moving around, but they weren't moving around in parallel motion like parallel organum. They were moving independently of each other. One voice might go up, one voice might go down, one voice might stay the same, and that's what we call free organum. All right. These next terms from the medieval era are a little bit easier to understand in terms of, I always like to think antiqua, I think of antiques, like something old. Ars antiqua is considered the old style of music from about 1100 to 1300. Music adds harmonies to chants, also known as organum, which is what we just talked about. That was the old style. Ars Antiqua. Ars Nova is considered the new art in the 14th and 15th centuries. So this is where the invention of modern musical notation, new rhythms, all of this was happening during the Ars Nova. So new music. Ars Antiqua, the old style. Ars Nova, the new style. Here's when we started to see singers and songwriters that would travel around Europe singing secular songs. Those were called troubadours. Now remember, music has been so much revolving around the church, and now we have troubadours that are singing secular songs or non religious songs as they travel around. So this is something that is new. During the Ars Nova, or the new music, I referenced music notation. Even earlier than that, as I was showing you some of the organum, I referenced little squiggles that were used for notation. Those were called neumes, Neumes. You can see that there on the screen. Those were the little squiggles above the text that helped to show the singers how to sing those words, whether they went up or they went down or they held it. It didn't show how high or how low to start, so it could sound different every single time somebody sang something because they didn't know where to start. They just knew, okay, well, I'm going to go up and then down and then up and then up. And it was really hard to keep track of. So let's learn about music notation. Because I always think Harry Potter when I think music notation.
Most students in elementary school learn how to read musical notation. They learn the note heads and the lines of the staff, and possibly even read some of it on recorders or other instruments. But what I find lacking in a lot of these discussions is why music notation is the way it is. If necessity is the mother of invention, what was the necessity that led to this innovation? And what did the great grandmothers of our current innovations look like? Well, strap in. I've got a lot of information to give you and only a few minutes to give it. Hi, welcome to the Listener's Guide. I'm Steve, and as we've discussed in previous episodes, a lot of Western music history has its roots in the medieval Catholic Church, and notation is no different. The earliest systems that we have of music notation are called neumes, and they were simply squiggles above religious texts that were designed to jog monks' memories while they were performing the Mass. They were codified, but as you can see, they don't really tell you anything unless you had already learned the chant orally. And this imprecision was a very big problem of the Catholic Church, who was interested in standardizing the Mass across the entire empire. Enter Guido of Arezzo, a music educator so important that he deserves his own video. But for our purposes today, all we need to discuss is that he developed a 4-line staff with one or more of the lines labeled by letter, so that the pitches could be accurately represented. And in fact, this system was so revolutionary that it's basically what we use today. You may notice, for instance, that this clef labeling the G and D lines looks curiously similar to the modern-day treble clef. So this system spread quickly at the hands of the church. Now performers could read and perform music without having to have heard it first. But there was one major problem. Because it could only reflect pitch and wasn't very good at reflecting duration, it was only effective for notating chant music because chant music was the only music that was performed that way. By the 13th century, however, people had begun to adapt the symbology of Gregorian chant to reflect this sense of rhythm. Notes were essentially divided into long and short, and in fact, those were the symbols' names, except in Latin. Long and breve. Now, because some notes are incredibly long and other notes are incredibly short, the system was expanded, but the idea remained pretty much the same. With this innovation of rhythm, we see a massive outpouring of other kinds of music, especially of the secular variety. Now that people could accurately write down the music that they came up with, we also had a new kind of musician show up, a composer. People wanted to take credit for the music that they were creating. Throughout the Renaissance and into the Baroque era, technology also continued to develop, which had its own effect on notation. You may have noticed, for instance, that so far most of the notes we've seen have been very thick, very black notes, which are easy to write with a calligraphy pen on parchment, but become rather runny when applied to paper. And for this reason, we start to see a shift toward what we call white note notation, where the notes are mostly made up of outlines instead of being filled in. This was also advantageous after the development of the printing press because it allowed printers to save ink. The notes grew rounder over time and developed into the ones that you may be more familiar with today. We also see the addition of the bar line around the 16th and 17th centuries, which gave greater visual clarity to rhythm, which up until that point had been dictated by a somewhat more complicated system called mensuration. We're not going to get into that system today, but my Second Balcony supporters on Patreon will get their own mini video about that as their reward video for this week. But this 17th century model seems to be where most music teachers stop, and I never really understood why. There are plenty of musical situations that cannot be notated with this format. Take, for instance, how Renaissance lute players were reading off of tablature because the staff didn't entirely suit their needs, or how incredibly dense piano music often incorporates a third staff to make the notes legible, or perhaps how Steve Reich had to invent his own kind of notation for his piano duet called Piano Face to represent the fact that one of the players had to speed up slightly faster than the other one so that they were no longer in sync, or how John Cage wrote entire pieces that were conceived only as notation that the performer was to interpret however they saw fit. There are plenty of musical situations that demand their own kind of notation, and it's important to remember that when we discuss musical notation. It is and always has been an incredibly fluid practice that depends more on the desired performance than anything else. So, what about you? What are some interesting notations that you've come across in your musical experiences? Or perhaps what's one musical activity that you've wanted to do and haven't necessarily had the notation to do it with? Please let me know in the comments. A special thank you to everybody who followed up on my video last week and supported me on Patreon. There's still time to do that, link in the description. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you all next time on the Listener's Guide.
All right. So we just learned about how Guido de Arezzo developed music notation, and it was the precursor to our modern music notation that we still use today. What's the importance of that? Well, as you heard in the video, it allowed music to be fixed onto a page. People didn't have to just remember it and pass it down, kind of like how we've talked about with folk songs last year. Now they didn't have to remember it. They could look on a page and be reminded. It allowed people to sing the song who had never heard the song before. They could read the notes on the page. It also allowed composers to plot out more complicated music. So this was a huge thing in the medieval times, was Guido de Arezzo developing the musical notation. All right, that is the end of part 1. Make sure you watch part 2, where we will be talking about different instruments and composers of the medieval time period. Thanks. Have a great day.